65 miles in 6 hours. That is how fast a wall of fire moved across western Nebraska on a single Thursday afternoon, outrunning every truck, every tractor, and every firefighter trying to stand in its path. And buried inside this disaster is a detail so infuriating, so deeply troubling, that once you hear it, you will not be able to stop thinking about it. Because one of these fires was not an accident of nature. One of these fires was deliberately set by the very government agency responsible for protecting the land it destroyed. But we will get to that. First, you need to understand the scale of what has happened, because this is now officially the largest wildfire event in the entire recorded history of the state of Nebraska, and the national conversation has barely caught up. Let us start with what unfolded on Thursday, March 12th. Red flag warnings had been issued across the entirety of Nebraska. That is not a localized concern, not a county-level heads-up. The entire state was flagged. Wind speeds topped 74 miles per hour, which, for context, meets the threshold for a Category 1 hurricane. Relative humidity plummeted to 14%. The air was essentially bone dry, the kind of dryness where a single spark becomes a catastrophe in seconds. And then, in Morill County, northeast of Bridgeport, a power line snapped. Sparks hit grass that had not seen meaningful moisture in months, grass so dry that fire scientists classify it as 1-hour fuel, meaning it can transition from dormant to explosive in 60 minutes flat. The Morill fire ignited instantly, and it moved east with a ferocity that left firefighters with no options. By nightfall, it had ripped through Garden County, swept across Arthur County, and was bearing down on Lake McConaughey, the largest reservoir in the state, where roughly 1,000 homes sit along the north shore. 65 miles, 6 hours. Think about that pace for a moment. That fire was covering ground faster than most people drive on a highway in bad weather. Ralph Moll, the fire chief of Keystone Lemoyne Fire and Rescue, the department positioned directly between the advancing fire and those 1,000 homes, watched it coming. And he said 5 words that tell you everything about the gravity of what firefighters were facing. He said, "I've got a bad feeling about tomorrow." That is not panic. That is a veteran reading conditions and understanding that what was coming next was going to be worse than what they had already seen. And it was not just one fire. That same Thursday, south of Interstate 80, the Cottonwood Fire ignited near Brady and raced through Lincoln and Dawson counties with terrifying speed. At 2 minutes past 9 that night, the Dawson County Sheriff began going door to door through the community of Farnham, personally ordering every resident to evacuate east to Eustis. Alan Oberg, a retired volunteer firefighter, stood outside and watched. His description is the most honest summary of the situation anyone has given. He said the wind was uncontrolled, blowing so hard there was no way to drive through where the fire was, so they basically had to watch a lot of it burn. Just stand there and watch. Here is the thing about wildfires. They are supposed to slow down at night, lower temperatures, slightly higher humidity, reduced wind. That is the window firefighters count on to regroup, to establish lines, to get ahead of the front. These fires did not slow down. They kept burning through the darkness. By Friday morning, the Morill fire alone had consumed 453,000 acres. The Cottonwood fire had crossed 50,000 acres. And then there was the third fire, the one that changes the entire nature of this story. The Road 203 fire did not start from a downed power line. It did not start from a spark thrown by a passing vehicle. It started from a prescribed burn conducted by the United States Forest Service. The agency deliberately set fire to land on Tuesday, March 10th, in the Bessie Ranger District of the Nebraska National Forest. They completed the burn, declared it finished, and moved it into what they call monitoring status. 36 hours later, when those 74-mile-per-hour winds tore across the state, the burn escaped, and the fire that was supposed to be a controlled, beneficial tool of land management ripped through more than 36,000 acres of the very forest it was supposed to protect. The Forest Service released a statement saying that forecasted weather conditions at the time of the burn were within parameters. Let that sink in for a moment. Red flag warnings blanketed the entire state the day the fire escaped. The grass across western Nebraska had not been meaningfully wet in months. Wind speeds reached hurricane force. And the Forest Service says those conditions were within parameters, which raises a question that nobody at any official briefing has been willing to answer directly. If those conditions fall within the acceptable range, what exactly falls outside of it? What would have to happen for the Forest Service to say, actually, maybe we should not light anything on fire this week? And here is why that question carries so much weight. The last time the Forest Service lost control of a prescribed burn under remarkably similar conditions was in New Mexico in 2022. That escaped burn became the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon Fire, the largest wildfire in New Mexico's recorded history. The federal government ultimately acknowledged fault and committed to paying $5.45 billion in damages. $5.45 billion. And now, in Nebraska, the pattern is repeating. A prescribed burn, extreme drought, high winds, an escape. And so far, no investigation has been announced, no accountability framework has been established, and no apology has been issued. Meanwhile, a fourth fire, the Anderson Bridge Fire, broke out near Valentine in Cherry County, 130 miles north of the other blazes. 4 simultaneous fires, 200 miles of active burning front, 0% containment, 600,000 combined acres gone. And a grandmother named Rose White, trying to flee her home in Arthur County, did not make it out. The drought conditions that made all of this possible are staggering. Western Nebraska currently sits in D3 extreme drought on the U.S. Drought Monitor. Conditions have worsened for 5 consecutive weeks. Over the past 6 months, Omaha has received just 14% of its normal precipitation. Norfolk has received 11%. These are not dry conditions. These are historically catastrophically dry conditions, the kind of dryness where the landscape itself becomes fuel, waiting for ignition. And Nebraska is not alone in this. That is perhaps the most alarming dimension of the entire situation. The red flag warnings issued on March 15th covered 6 states simultaneously: Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. Oklahoma evacuated 4,000 people from communities in the fire path. Fire behavior analysts in Oklahoma documented head fire spread rates of 400 to 550 feet per minute with flame lengths exceeding 22 feet. Southern Colorado has experienced 25 red flag warning days in 2025 alone, which works out to roughly 1 in every 3 days since January 1st. Colorado shut off power to 18,000 customers as a precaution. The entire Great Plains region is burning, and the fire season that was supposed to begin in summer effectively started in winter. The National Interagency Fire Center published its March outlook 10 days before the Nebraska fires started. That outlook specifically identified above normal fire potential stretching from the southern Rockies into the southern plains through the month of March. The prediction was accurate. The preparation was not sufficient. And Senator Pete Ricketts articulated the logistical nightmare at Saturday's briefing when he acknowledged that other states are facing the same challenges simultaneously. Nebraska is competing for the same limited pool of federal firefighting resources as Oklahoma, Colorado, Texas, and Kansas. Everyone needs help at the same time, and there is not enough help to go around. And the federal agency that is supposed to coordinate and provide much of that help is the same agency that started one of the fires. Governor Pillen declared a state of emergency across 7 counties and deployed the National Guard with Black Hawk helicopters. The Omaha Fire Department, stationed 350 miles to the east, sent a crew west for the first time in decades. The Nebraska State Patrol restricted airspace over the fire zones. 47 miles of highway were closed. 300 people were evacuated from Dawson County alone. 11 structures were confirmed destroyed, though that number is almost certainly going to grow as damage assessments continue, and 30,000 head of cattle have been displaced in the middle of calving season, which is the worst possible timing for ranchers already operating on razor-thin margins. Hundreds of thousands of acres of rangeland fencing have been destroyed, and anyone who understands agricultural operations knows that fencing is not just expensive to replace, it is the fundamental infrastructure that makes ranching possible. But within all of this devastation, there are stories that remind you what people are capable of when systems fail and communities are left to fend for themselves. At the North Platte Recreation Center on Friday afternoon, Red Cross volunteers opened cots and laid out blankets for evacuees. Across town, a woman named Char Merrill Swalberg set up a supply station and started collecting eye drops, baby wipes, Gatorade, cooling towels, new socks, and foot powder for firefighters who had been running without sleep for more than 30 hours. Jay Nordhausen at Ogallala Livestock began coordinating hay and fencing supplies for ranchers who had lost everything. His summary of the situation was 4 words: "It is just horrible." And in Lincoln County, overnight Saturday, when the fire surged again with several large flare-ups threatening multiple homes, it was not a government response team that saved those structures. Farmers fired up their own tractors and disc plows at 3 in the morning and cut fire breaks through their own land. By 5 a.m., every house was still standing. Not because the system worked, because the people who lived there refused to let their neighbors lose everything. Now here is what comes next, and it is the reason no one in western Nebraska is exhaling with relief. The Rocky Mountain Complex Incident Management Team assumed command on Saturday evening, but as of Sunday morning they were still scouting, still assessing. They stated publicly that maps, size estimates, and other fire statistics were not yet available. The people managing this disaster do not yet fully know how big it is. A cold front did arrive, dropping temperatures from 69 degrees down to 31 degrees overnight, with wind chills plunging to -7. Some snow fell on the northwest edge of the Marill fire. On the surface, that sounds like the break everyone has been praying for. It is not. National Weather Service meteorologist Sean Jacobs issued a warning that the next 10 days could bring a rapid return to summer-like temperatures, high wind gusts, and critically low relative humidity. By midweek, forecasts show highs rebounding into the 80s and 90s across the fire zone, with continued gusty winds. The cold front is a pause, not a resolution. The underlying conditions that created this disaster have not changed. The drought has not broken. The grass is still dead and dry. The wind will return. There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that 600,000 acres have burned, that containment remains at 0%, that a woman died trying to escape, that 30,000 cattle are displaced, that farmers are cutting their own fire breaks at 3 in the morning because help cannot get there fast enough, and that one of the fires was started by a prescribed burn conducted by the agency tasked with preventing exactly this kind of catastrophe. The Forest Service says its parameters were met. The families who lost their land, their livestock, their fencing, and in one case their grandmother, might define parameters differently. Somewhere in the Nebraska sandhills tonight, snow is falling on ground that was burning 12 hours ago. The wind is shifting direction. The temperature is dropping now, but will climb again within days. And every firefighter, every rancher, every family living near Lake McConaughey knows the same thing Ralph Mole knew when he watched that fire approaching. Tomorrow could be worse. The conditions that built this disaster took months to develop, and they will not reverse in a week. The fires are not contained. The drought is not over. The wind will come back. And the question of how a government agency set a fire 2 days before hurricane-force winds in the middle of the worst drought in years and called it within parameters, that question is going to outlast the flames themselves. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.